A black doctor moved his family into a white suburb. On his morning run, police cruisers stalked him. His mailbox dripped with slurs, and at the fall festival, the white realtor who chaired the HOA pointed him out as a threat to property values. The crowd closed in until one powerful voice cut through and flipped the night on its head. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The morning mist clung to the sidewalks of Willowbrook Estates like a thin shroud, and Dr. Jonathan Hayes welcomed its cool embrace as he stepped out of his new colonial home. The air carried the faint scent of wet leaves and chimney smoke, an autumn morning he might once have found comforting. But this was not the neighborhood near the hospital where porches carried laughter and bikes littered driveways. This was Willowbrook, quiet, manicured, and watchful. At 43, Jonathan knew first impressions carried weight, and here each one felt heavier than it should. He and Rebecca had moved in only 2 weeks ago. Their boxes were barely unpacked, the dining table still unsteady, and yet the neighborhood had already measured them, sorted them as outsiders. He set his watch and fell into stride, his breath clouding in the crisp October air. Running was meant to be sanctuary, the one place he could let thought run loose before returning to the steady hands and life-or-death decisions of cardiology. Sometimes he pictured Rebecca asleep after a late night at the children's hospital, and the quiet of the street felt like a fleeting gift they shared. Maple leaves blazed overhead in reds and oranges, scattering light across the pavement. Jonathan's eyes caught on the jeweled dew of a spider's web, the ritual of old Mr. Ferguson retrieving his newspaper. Years of working beside mortality had trained him to notice life where it flickered. Turning onto Birch Lane, he slowed. Ahead, 3 figures lingered. Mrs. Whitfield with her terrier Rusty, Mrs. Caldwell in a quilted jacket, and between them Brad Hutchinson. Even without the whispers Jonathan had heard since moving in, he would have recognized him. Hutchinson carried himself like a man who believed the street belonged to him. Blazer too sharp for morning, stance wide, smile practiced into a weapon. Whitfield tightened her grip on the leash. Caldwell glanced toward Hutchinson, waiting. He pivoted smoothly. Grin pitched just between welcome and warning. "Morning run, Dr. Hayes." His voice carried for all 3 to hear. "Brad Hutchinson, real estate for half the homes here, chair of our HOA." He extended a hand, proprietary in its confidence. "We like to keep Willowbrook consistent." Jonathan clasped it briefly. The grip a test more than a greeting. "Jonathan Hayes. My wife Rebecca and I moved in 2 weeks ago." "Ah yes," Hutchinson said, nodding as though he had approved the move himself. "The Colonial on Hawthorne Drive. Property values depend on community standards after all." His eyes traveled deliberately from Jonathan's vest to his face. "I'm sure you'll respect that." Whitfield bobbed her head. Caldwell added flatly, "Standards are everything." Jonathan nodded politely and continued down the lane, but the morning no longer felt like sanctuary. Minutes later, in the small business district, edging the suburb, the low growl of an engine shadowed him. A Charlotte Mecklenburg police cruiser rolled slowly beside the officer inside studying him. Jonathan's pulse spiked, not from exertion, but recognition. He'd run this same route every morning since the move. Same vest, same hour. Yet he knew how easily his presence, a black man in a white enclave, could be recast as suspicion. The cruiser trailed him for 6 blocks, close enough to remind, distant enough to pretend chance. Jonathan kept his eyes forward, arms pumping, stride steady. His mind ticked through scenarios. Had Hutchinson whispered something already? Did Whitfield or Caldwell make a call? Should he stop, risk seeming confrontational, or keep moving, swallow the indignity? Choices his white neighbors never considered, pressed like iron across his chest. When he finally turned onto his own street, relief mingled with exhaustion. The cruiser was gone, but unease stayed lodged beneath his ribs. At his steps he saw David Rodriguez watering hydrangeas. David lifted a hand. "Beautiful morning for a run, Doc," he called. "Grin warm. One of these days I'll join you, but my bed keeps winning." Jonathan smiled back, grateful for the kindness. The invitation's always open. He merely asked if David had ever been followed by a cruiser. Almost, But the weight of that question was its own exhaustion. Stretching against the porch railing, he caught sight of Whitfield again. This time she stood with Caldwell, heads bent, hands gesturing toward his house. Caldwell's palm sliced the air. Whitfield nodded. When they noticed his gaze, both turned, too quickly. Jonathan's stomach dropped. The police had not appeared by chance. Someone had called, and in their whispers, he heard the faint echo of phrases Hutchinson had already seeded. Standards, values, belonging. The realtor's smile from earlier lingered in his mind, and with it the certainty his hand was already tightening around them. 3 days later, Jonathan was reviewing patient charts when his assistant knocked. The new patient in room 418 wanted to see someone in charge who actually knows what they're doing. The words hit with the dull ache of an old bruise. 16 years in, cardiology, more than 2,000 surgeries, 4 years as chief of one of North Carolina's top hospitals, and still the refrain. Inside, Charles Brennan lay propped against white pillows, a retired police captain of 70, with the stiff posture of a man unwilling to yield to illness. Beside him sat his daughter Patricia, hands clasped tight, eyes scanning the room like an inspector, searching for flaws. Jonathan entered, noting the subtle shift. Patricia's brows lifted, Charles' jaw clenched. The verdict was delivered before he spoke. Mr. Brennan and Miss Patricia Brennan, I presume. I'm Dr. Jonathan Hayes, Chief of Cardiology, he said, extending a steady hand. I understand you'd like to discuss treatment options. Charles' grip was firm but clipped. Chief of Cardiology. You look young for the job. How long have you been practicing? 16 years. Residency at Duke, fellowship at Emory, chief here for 4. Jonathan pulled a chair to eye level. Let's talk about your heart. Patricia leaned in, voice measured but taut. Doctor, my father was a police captain for 35 years. He's used to people who know what they're doing. Perhaps we could get a second opinion from someone with more experience. No offense, but this is my father's life. She hesitated, then added almost casually. We know Brad Hutchinson. He helped my niece sell her house last spring. Very respected around here. Jonathan felt the name grind like sand in the gears. Hutchinson again reaching past lawns into hospital corridors. Charles' voice cut in heavy with command. Patricia, what I want to know is whether this hospital vets its staff properly. In my experience, people get promoted for political reasons. I want to be sure we're not dealing with some diversity hire. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Mr. Brennan, I can call Dr. Morrison, our senior attending of 24 years. But your EKG shows significant ST and your troponin levels confirm active heart muscle damage. We have hours, not days, before permanent loss. Charles, color drained, but Patricia's chin stayed high. And you'd be performing the procedure yourself. With respect, we'd prefer someone with a proven record. Patricia, Charles said, lecturing. This is what I've been saying. People put in positions before they're ready and others pay the price. I saw it in the force countless times. Jonathan rose slowly, his 6.2 frame casting a long shadow across the bed. His voice was low, precise. I graduated summa cum laude, trained, in one of the most competitive residencies in the country. I've performed over 3,000 cardiac procedures, with success rates above national averages, published 47 peer-reviewed papers, recognized 5 years running by the American College of Cardiology for clinical excellence. What I have never done is compromise patient care for prejudice. He let the words settle, gaze locked on Charles. You have 3 hours before irreversible damage. You can trust the physician qualified to save your life. Or you can keep debating until your heart stops arguing for you. Silence followed. Patricia's hands unclenched at last. Charles's eyes flickered. Anger, pride, but also the dawning awareness that his contempt could cost him everything. Jonathan stood steady. This was the weight he knew too well. Skill and record laid bare, yet still forced to prove what should never have been in question. The harassment began subtly, so gradually that Jonathan at first dismissed each incident as coincidence. One morning, a flyer for a neighborhood watch meeting appeared beneath his windshield wiper, the date circled in red. A note scrolled, "Concerned residents only, Days later, his newspaper vanished repeatedly, forcing him into the yard at dawn, jogging shoes still damp, combing hedges for the missing pages. Rebecca noticed the pattern before he did. A pediatric surgeon trained to detect the faintest anomaly in a child's heartbeat, she caught the dissonance in their daily rhythm. "Jonathan," she said one evening, as she chopped herbs with deliberate precision, "we're the only house that didn't get an invitation to the Morrisons' anniversary party." The words carried a weight sharper than the knife in her hand. The Morrisons lived 4 doors down their celebration, the talk of the street for weeks. Every neighbor had a hand-delivered card except them. Jonathan set his knife down, listening to the tick of the kitchen clock. Maybe an oversight, but he knew it wasn't. He'd seen Hutchinson's hand in neighborhood affairs before. Subtle exclusions disguised as accidents. The escalation came quickly. That Saturday, Jonathan returned from his run to find Rebecca in the yard, fists rigid at her sides. The word "opidity" dripped in red paint across their mailbox, letters still wet enough to glisten in the sun. Jonathan's throat tightened when his voice cracked, strange to his own ears. Within the last hour, Rebecca said tightly, "I found it while Mrs. Caldwell walked her dog." She looked straight at it, then at me, kept walking. No sympathy, no outrage, just silence. Jonathan's fists curled until the veins in his hands stood out. The slur wasn't random. It was chosen with precision, meant to sting, to reduce him to a caricature. It was the word used against black men who dared to excel, who refused to know their place. He heard in the back of his mind his father's voice, warning that dignity always carried a cost. It felt too sudden, too coordinated, as if Hutchinson had been laying groundwork long before they arrived. "We should call the police," Jonathan said. Though even as the words left his mouth, memory surged, the cruiser tailing him on his morning runs, the officer's unreadable stare. Rebecca shook her head. "I did. Officer Martinez said they'd file a report. But unless we've witnesses or cameras, there's not much they can do." He suggested more lights, maybe a security system, as if illumination could chase the shadow in people's hearts. But the worst came later that afternoon. After a trip to Home Depot for paint, they returned to find trash cans overturned across their driveway, garbage strewn like battlefield wreckage. On the front step lay a note written on expensive stationery, the script delicate but merciless. "Dr. and Mrs. Hayes, some residents have expressed concerns about your family's impact on our neighborhood's character and property values. Perhaps you would be more comfortable in a community better suits your lifestyle." At the bottom, neatly, typed the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. Jonathan read it 3 times. Each word burned hotter. The formal phrasing, the staged signature. It stank of Hutchinson's polish, the realtor's knack for making poison sound professional. Behind him, Rebecca trembled with rage. "Jonathan," she whispered, voice fraying, "I've performed surgery on over 500 children. I've saved lives, written research, volunteered at free clinics, and they tell us we don't belong because of our lifestyle." Her hand shook, and Jonathan saw with a pang the same steadiness she used in surgery. Now, betrayed by anger, she couldn't, suture shut. That evening the house sat heavy with silence. From the window, Jonathan watched a white SUV crawl past for the 3rd time in an hour, tinted windows concealing the driver's face. When he stepped closer, the car sped off around the corner. "They want us afraid," Rebecca said beside him, her breath fogging the glass. "This isn't random anymore. It's organized." Jonathan nodded, jaw tight. He could feel Hutchinson's shadow behind it all, using whispers, notes, and neighbors like pawns. What had begun as subtle slights had now grown into vandalism, threats, and surveillance, and Jonathan, staring into the street light pooling across his lawn, felt the question burn in his chest. How far would Hutchinson take this? The man's fingerprints were everywhere on the flyers. The careful wording of the eviction-style note, even in the way. Whitfield and Caldwell echoed his phrases like loyal clients repeating a pitch. The following evening, the Willowbrook Homeowners Association convened in the community center. Jonathan and Rebecca sat near the back, determined to listen. The hall smelled of floor wax and burnt coffee. Folding chairs clattered. Whispers buzzed. At the front, Brad Hutchinson stood as though the meeting belonged to him. He wore no tie, just a pressed shirt with rolled sleeves, real estate casual, polished, yet one of us. His watch flashed under the lights each time he gestured, drawing eyes, like a spotlight. "Neighbours," Hutchinson began, voice rich and confident. "We've all noticed changes. Police cruisers circling our streets, tension where there used to be trust, incidents, graffiti, complaints drawing attention we don't want. The truth is simple. Our property values depend on stability, on people who belong." A hum of agreement ran through the room. Mrs. Whitfield nodded, eagerly. Caldwell's lips tightened in approval. Hutchinson paced, knowing he had them. "I'm not naming names," he said, letting the pause hang. His eyes swept the crowd, landing just briefly on Jonathan and Rebecca. "But when newcomers bring disruption, when their presence makes longtime residents feel unsafe, it is our duty as an association to act. Protecting Willowbrook isn't prejudice, it's preservation." Rebecca's hands curled in her lap until her knuckles widened. Jonathan felt the air thin, heavy, with the same coded menace he had grown up hearing in other rooms, in other towns. Hutchinson's smile sharpened. "Some of you have asked me to speak for you, and I will. Standards matter. Character matters. If we don't enforce them, Willowbrook becomes just another subdivision." The applause was small but sharp, a sound that cut more than it cheered. Jonathan sat still, pulse in his throat, remembering his father's voice telling him, "They'll never say it plain, but you'll feel it all the same." When the meeting ended, Hutchinson lingered by the door, shaking hands like a man sealing contracts. Caldwell and Whitfield flanked him, nodding at every word, lieutenants in his campaign. Outside, the night air was cool, tinged with the smell of cinnamon from the bakery across the street. Jonathan inhaled sharply, steadying himself. The fall festival was days away, and the PTA flyer had even noted that Governor Walsh would stop by the reading tent around noon. Something told him Hutchinson would not be content with whispers or flyers anymore. The festival smelled of cinnamon and cider, of roasted nuts and carved pumpkins. Tradition wrapped in warmth, soon to become the stage for his next very public assault. That night, after painting over the red slur on their mailbox and clearing the trash from the lawn, the house sat heavy with silence. Rebecca fell asleep on the couch, exhaustion finally pressing her eyelids shut. But Jonathan remained awake, staring at the faint glow of the streetlight through the curtains. He thought of his father and Raleigh, telling him, "As a boy, you'll have to run twice as far to be seen as equal, and someday, son, they'll still call you less." Back then, Jonathan had believed hard work would be the answer. Degrees, honors, every credential earned and re-earned. But tonight, staring at the words still ghosted under a fresh coat of paint, he wondered if effort alone would ever be enough. Rebecca stirred half asleep. "What are you thinking?" she murmured. "That maybe I was foolish," Jonathan whispered back. "Foolish to think we could move here and just live like everyone else." Her hand reached for his fingers, warm, steady, not foolish, brave. "They want us silent, and we're not going to give them that." Jonathan pressed her hand to his lips, breathing in the faint scent of lemon soap. For a moment, the noise of the neighborhood receded, replaced by memory and resolve. He wasn't only defending a house or a street, he was defending the promise his father had given him. That dignity might bend, but it didn't have to break. The quiet stretched, and in that stillness, Jonathan felt the anger cool into something sharper, steadier, readiness. The breaking point came during the neighborhood's annual fall festival, an event Jonathan had wanted to skip after weeks of harassment. But Rebecca, with the steely determination that made her such a formidable surgeon, refused to yield. "We live here," she said firmly, leaning close to the mirror as she traced a precise line of lipstick. Her tone carried both defiance and fatigue, as if she were reminding herself as much as him. "We pay the same property taxes. We follow the same HOA rules. We belong here, and I will not let a handful of cowards write us out of our own story. The festival smelled of cinnamon and woods, the crisp bite of cider drifting through the air. Laughter of children rose from the pumpkin carving tables, though. The moment Jonathan and Rebecca entered the park, the timber shifted. Conversations faltered. He could feel the silence stretching taut between glances, the way people angled their shoulders to include or exclude. By the hot chocolate booth, Jonathan tried to ground himself in normally, trading polite words with David and Maria Rodriguez, but a voice cut across the chatter, sharp, self-assured, and deliberately loud. Brad Hutchinson, Therill estate agent, stood near the pumpkin display, his checked blazer too crisp for the casual setting, his stance wide like a man on a stage. He wasn't just talking. He was performing, feeding off the crowd's unease. This used to be family-friendly neighborhood, Hutchinson declared, gesturing broadly as if unveiling some hidden truth. People looked out for each other. But now we've got newcomers who don't share our values, who treat this place like it's just another investment. Property values are fragile. Standards matter. If we don't protect them, we lose what makes Willowbrook special. The line was familiar. Jonathan realized Hutchinson had been whispering versions of it for years, warning sellers to think twice before accepting certain offers, urging neighbors to reconsider who they wanted living next door. Hutchinson never named names, but the effect was the same. Suspicion had spread like smoke under a door. Mrs. Whitfield's head bobbed vigorously. Exactly. Some people think money lets them bulldoze over tradition. They forget there are unwritten rules. Rebecca's hand slid into Jonathan's. Her grip was steady, but he felt the subtle tightening of her jaw, the kind of controlled pressure she used in the operating room when a patient's heart began to falter. Then, Mrs. Caldwell, with a conspiratorial tilt of her chin, added fuel. And let's not ignore the police reports. Suspicious activity, people wandering at odd hours, residents feeling unsafe. Jonathan caught the way Hutchinson's lips twitched, not surprise, but satisfaction. Of course, he had seeded those whispers himself. Packaging. Jonathan's dawn runs into concerns and feeding them to anyone willing to listen. The words hit Jonathan like a slap. He thought of his shoes pounding the pavement, the fog of his breath and the cold twisted into evidence against him. A hollow anger coiled in his chest, the kind he usually locked behind professional restraint. He stepped forward, his voice slicing through the autumn air. "Excuse me? I believe you're talking about my family." The crowd turned. Hutchinson's smirk faltered, but only for an instant. He spread his arms, playing to his audience. "Dr. Hayes, this isn't about you specifically." Jonathan cut him off, his tone low, but flint-edged. "You mentioned values. You mentioned police reports. I run the same route every morning. I'm a cardiologist. My wife is a pediatric surgeon. We've contributed more to this community than many standing here tonight. So tell me, Mr. Hutchinson, what values do we lack? And why exactly don't we belong?" A shuffle of discomfort. Mrs. Whitfield tried her well-practiced dismissal. "Doctor, no one is singling you out. You're being overly sensitive. We only want to maintain standards." Rebecca's voice entered calm yet unflinching. "Standards like vandalizing our mailbox with racial slurs. Standards like threatening notes shoved under our door, or the standard that says we can't walk our dog without someone calling the police." The crowd shifted. Shock registered on some faces. Others looked down guilty in their silence. From the back, Charles Brennan thundered red-faced. "Now wait a minute. Nobody should put up with vandalism, but don't act like concerns here aren't legitimate. This neighborhood is changing too fast, and some of us have every right to question it." Jonathan turned, and years of swallowed indignation cracked. "Mr. Brennan, isaved your life. You called me a diversity hire before you even bothered to read my credentials. What is it you fear? That a cardiothoracic surgeon and a pediatric surgeon will somehow devalue your neighborhood?" The air thickened, tension pulling tight like a drawn bowring. Before Brennan could answer, another voice cut through. Jonathan Hayes." The crowd parted. Governor Catherine Walsh strode forward in jeans and a faded sweatshirt. The ordinary, clothes unable to dim the authority that moved with her. She smiled, her presence disarming and commanding at once. What followed unraveled Hutchinson's theater in seconds. Walsh spoke warmly of family dinners, of Jonathan's counsel during her campaign, of Rebecca's research saving children across the state. Her words hung in the autumn air like undeniable testimony, each one pressing Hutchinson further into silence. But he didn't vanish easily. Hutchinson forced a laugh, brittle and thin. "Governor, with all due respect, this isn't about politics. It's about protecting what we've built here. People deserve to feel safe in their own neighborhood." Walsh's gaze sharpened. The kind that silenced state legislators. Safe from what? Mr. Hutchinson, from surgeons who save lives, from families who pay their taxes and raise their children with integrity. I'd say the only danger here is the poison of exclusion. The crowd rippled. Some nodded openly now. Others turned away from Hutchinson. His smile held, but his eyes betrayed. The calculation of a man watching ground slip beneath him. When Walsh finally turned to the neighbors and said, "You're lucky to have them." The hush that followed wasn't just silence. It was the sound of a community realizing the stage had shifted. Hutchinson's jaw clenched, hands twitching at his blazer sleeves. He stood rooted, still smiling for show. But Jonathan caught the flicker. There, not surrender, but defiance banked low like coals waiting for wind. A child laughed near the cider stand. Leaves rattled against the pavement, and in that fragile quiet, Jonathan felt for the first time in weeks that maybe silence could be victory, even if somewhere beneath it Hutchinson was already plotting his next move. Word of the festival confrontation spread through Charlotte's medical community with the speed only small-town gossip can achieve. By Monday morning, Jonathan found himself the subject of whispered conversations in hospital corridors, sympathetic glances from nursing staff, and the uneasy awareness that his private life had become public property. But gossip alone hadn't carried Thestery this far. Hutchinson had made sure of that. In the days after the festival, he worked the phones like a man patching leaks on a sinking ship. To one hospital board member, whose cousin happened to be one of his real estate clients, Hutchinson murmured that Dr. Hayes had seemed unstable, emotional, even combative. After a few neighbors raised innocent concerns to another acquaintance on the PTA, he described Jonathan as a brilliant surgeon maybe, but under obvious stress, the kind of stress that clouds judgment. Hutchinson never lied outright. He didn't need to. He knew how to salt the air with enough suggestion that silence would do theirs. By the time Jonathan walked into work Monday, the fallout was already waiting. The situation came to a head during the weekly departmental meeting. Jonathan had led these for 4 years, usually steady affairs of case reviews and protocol updates. But this Monday the air felt charged, like the weight that builds before a storm. At the far end of the table sat Dr. Richard Thornfield, arms crossed, eyes glinting with the satisfaction of a man who finally smelled weakness. Passed over when Jonathan was promoted, Thornfield had never hidden his resentment. Now, with Hutchinson's whispers wafting into the hospital, he looked like someone who'd been handed a script. "Before we begin," Thornfield said, his voice heavier than his rank should allow, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Our department chief's recent publicity has raised serious concerns. I've heard from board members who question whether Dr. Hayes is in the right frame of mind to lead. There are reports he's been volatile, perhaps even unstable after confrontations in his own neighborhood. That reflects on all of us." The room went still. Jonathan felt his pulse spike. He recognized Hutchinson's fingerprints immediately. The word unstable lifted clean from the realtor's whisper campaign. Dr. Angela Foster shifted uneasily. "What exactly are you saying, Dr. Thornfield?" Thornfield leaned forward, savoring the moment. "I'm saying leaders don't drag personal disputes into public spectacles, and they certainly don't let emotional baggage spill into their professional life. I'm not the only one who's heard concerns that Dr. Hayes may not be thinking clearly." Jonathan caught it then. Not just Thornfield's jealousy, but Hutchinson's seed planted and watered until it sprouted in a hospital boardroom. This wasn't just about a festival anymore. Hutchinson had crossed into his career, twisting perception into threat. There it was again, Standards. The word landed like a stone. Jonathan saw several colleagues exchange uneasy glances. Some recognized the code, others perhaps agreed with it. He thought of Hutchinson's voice booming through the festival crowd. And now here it was again, recast in Thornfield's measured tone, cloaked in institutional concern. Dr. Lisa Park broke the silence, her voice sharp. With respect, Dr. Hayes was defending himself against harassment. What standards are you suggesting? Let's not be dramatic, Thornfield replied, though color rose in his cheeks. This isn't about race, it's about professionalism. Leaders don't play the victim every time their judgment is questioned. Angela Foster bristled. Play the victim when his mailbox was defaced, when his neighbors called the police on him for jogging. That's not playing the victim, that's surviving. The room erupted, voices collating, loyalties colliding. Jonathan sat very still, watching, listening, and beneath it all, one thought crystallized with cold certainty. Hutchinson had crossed from the streets of Willowbrook into the halls of Charlotte, Presbyterian. This was no longer coincidence, it was campaign. 2 weeks later, Jonathan received an unexpected visitor at the hospital. Charles Brennan, the former police captain whose emergency surgery had led to one of their most contentious encounters, appeared at his office door, looking uncomfortable but determined. Dr. Hayes, Brennan said, accepting Jonathan's invitation to sit down. I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you several apologies and probably my life. Jonathan waited silently, allowing the older man to find his words. I've been thinking about what happened both here at the hospital and at the festival, Brennan continued. After the governor spoke that day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then lying in that hospital bed gave me too much time to reflect. He drew a breath. I realized that I made assumptions about you based on prejudices I didn't even realize I had. You saved my life, and instead of being grateful, I questioned whether you were qualified to do your job. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. The apology was awkward, but genuine, and Jonathan could see the effort it had taken for the proud former police captain to make it. I appreciate you coming here to tell me that, Mr. Brennan. There's more, Brennan said, reaching into his jacket pocket. I wrote a letter to the hospital administration praising your medical care and professionalism. I also wrote one to the newspaper about what I witnessed at the festival. People need to know that what happened to your family wasn't acceptable. 3 months later, Jonathan stood at his bedroom window, watching the sun rise over Willowbrook, estates preparing for another morning run. The route remained the same, but the experience had changed significantly. The harassment had stopped after Governor Walsh's public support and the negative publicity that followed. Several neighbors had approached him and Rebecca with genuine apologies, while others simply began treating them with the basic courtesy they should have received from the beginning. Mrs. Whitfield, who had once crossed the street to avoid him, now made a point of waving during his morning runs. The gesture wasn't elaborate, but it represented a kind of progress that Jonathan had learned to appreciate in small increments. Not everyone had changed. Some neighbors still maintained a cool distance, but the overt hostility had ended. At the hospital, the changes were even more pronounced. Dr. Thornfield had requested a transfer to another department, unable to continue working under Jonathan's leadership after his failed coup attempt. The incident had prompted the hospital administration to implement new diversity and inclusion training, and Jonathan found himself consulted on policies designed to create more equitable treatment for all staff members. Most importantly, Jonathan had begun mentoring young physicians of color, sharing not just medical knowledge, but strategies for navigating professional environments where their competence would inevitably be questioned. Dr. Park had asked him to speak at a medical conference about leadership in diverse healthcare settings, and several medical schools had invited him to discuss career development with their students. Beyond the hospital walls, Willowbrook Estates itself had shifted. After the festival confrontation and the governor's very public words, the HOA convened to address leadership concerns. For the first time, Hutchinson was not the one at the podium. Within weeks, he had been voted out as chair. His polished speeches about standards and values, now too radioactive, even for those who once nodded along. Neighbors who had quietly followed his lead began crossing the street from him. Not Jonathan. A real estate client pulled 2 listings, citing unwanted publicity. The lights in Hutchinson's office still burned late, but fewer cars stopped by. It wasn't triumphal justice, no courtroom, no sirens, but it was consequence. His influence was thinner, fraying, no longer the unchallenged voice of Willowbrook. As Jonathan laced up his running shoes and prepared to step outside, he reflected on the lessons of the past few months. Change was possible, but it required confrontation. Progress was real, but it came in increments rather than revolutionary leaps. And perhaps most importantly, silence in the face of injustice served no one, not the victims, not the perpetrators, and certainly not the communities that needed healing. The morning air was crisp and welcoming as he began his familiar 5-mile loop. Footsteps echoing off streets where Heffenly felt, if not entirely at home, then no longer under siege. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a hopeful one, built on the understanding that dignity defended was dignity preserved, and that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that made it easier for the next person who didn't fit someone else's narrow definition of belonging. Behind him, lights flickered on in the windows of Willowbrook Estates, marking the start of another day in a community that was slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably learning Toby better than it had been. Jonathan thought of Hutchinson one last time, not the angry bluster at the festival, but the quieter poison he had tried to drip afterward, turning prejudice into prudence, bias into common sense. Hutchinson was quieter now, diminished, but not gone. The shadow of his influence lingered, though its edges were retreating, and yet, as Jonathan's breath fogged against the dawn, he recognized something else. Whispers lose their power once people stop listening. He pushed into his steady rhythm, each step carrying the weight of battles fought, the lessons claimed, and the fragile, hard-won hope that this silence might finally mean peace. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.